Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Tymochko from Michigan State University. And today she'll be telling us about detecting bifurcations in dynamical systems with zigzag persistent homology.
Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm excited to talk about this stuff. To get started, something we're hopefully all somewhat familiar with, persistent homology based on a point cloud using the RIPS filtration. So we know that we have some sort of circular shaped point cloud, and as we increase the radius of the RIPS filtration, we can watch the circles and connected components grow and merge and so on and so forth. But this particular setup handles a single persistent or a single point cloud really well. You're able to detect the circular features based on the births and deaths, but the question becomes, what about if you have more than one point cloud? So say we have an example where we have 5 different point clouds here. All of them are just basic circles, but we can kind of see that the circles on either end are significantly smaller than the ones in the middle. And maybe we only want to sort of detect the most prominent circular structures in this data. We could compute a persistence diagram for each one and try and look at those and see where the most circular features are and so on. We could do something with machine learning, converting these into a feature vector and trying to detect which ones are most circular or classify circular versus not. But those all become more computationally difficult and just adds on to what you have to do. So computing a persistence diagram for each and just adds on to the steps. So a question is, can we do this in a more simple manner? So a reminder of the basic setup for persistent homology: you have simplicial complexes with a set of inclusions all going in one direction. Then when you compute homology, you get induced maps on the homology groups. This is called a persistence module. But we're going to instead look at zigzag persistent homology, where maybe you have simplicial complexes, but you don't have inclusions going in all directions. If you think about the circle examples, how would you set up inclusions that would go nicely in one direction? It wouldn't really work. So here we'll maybe want to look at including in different directions, which induce maps on the homology that go in different directions as well. And this is called a zigzag module. So a zigzag module produces a zigzag persistence diagram, same as regular persistence, but rather than the births and deaths corresponding to some sort of scale in the RIPS complex, or depending on whatever filtration you use, instead it's going to depend on your location in the zigzag. So here's a small example where we have some red circle. Let's say it's not filled in. So we've got a circular loop here that includes into the union with the next one. So we have 3 original simplicial complexes, and we take the unions in between. And we want to see where these circular features exist through this whole filtration, or through the zigzag. And this will result in a diagram where we still have birth-death coordinates, but the birth coordinate corresponds to the index of where it first appears. So here we'll have a 0.01 corresponding to this red point because it appears in the 0th simplicial complex, but it doesn't quite make it to the first one. So it dies at this, it exists at the halfway, but dies going into the first. For the blue one, we'll have the coordinate 0.52 because it starts at this halfway point at that union, and it persists through and dies going into the second point. So here we're able to track where those circular features exist through these multiple steps. So back to our motivation, can we use this zigzag persistence to track where the most circular regions are? So maybe these 3 points in the middle, can we isolate that that's where the most circular features are through this sequence? So we're going to start set up with our collection of ordered point clouds. So here the order will matter because of the way the zigzag is set up. So you start with each one of your point clouds, and you're going to take the union in between, creating this nice zigzag pattern. So looking back at our simple example here, the colors correspond. So we have the smaller circle includes into the middle of that bigger circle. And we've got sort of this closer circle pattern in the middle, and then we get the last smaller circle at the end. But the homology of point clouds isn't interesting. So what we're going to do is we're going to compute the RIPS complex for a fixed radius to connect the vertices and start trying to see where those circular features exist at each one of these. So you could use the same radius across each one of these point clouds here, and the inclusions work if you use the same radius in the middle. Or you could pick a different radius for each one of the original point clouds and then use the maximum to ensure that those inclusions still hold. So when we look at that for our example, here we'll use different radii, but we can see that when we use the Rips complex, we get something that fills in here, but we see this circular feature persisting through these middle portions, which is sort of what we wanted to detect. So then we can compute the homology groups of this zigzag, getting these inclusion or getting the induced maps on the homology groups to track where the homological features move through this zigzag. And again, back to our example, we want to say that we have a circular feature from 1 to 3. When we compute the persistence diagram, we get that there's sort of 2 circular features, but we want to focus on this most prominent one here. The coordinates of that point are 1 and 3.5. So that corresponds to the fact that a circle appears here at the first one, it still persists through, but it dies between this third one and going into the fourth one. So we're able to detect that sort of middle region where these nice circles align. Again, so this is sort of that full zigzag or Rips complex sequence here with the inclusions into the unions. And we can see this smaller point would correspond to this smaller circle on the end. But we get this nice persistent circle through the middle portion here. This is clearly a very nice example, right? When do we ever see perfect circles in real data? It just doesn't happen. So let's look at a real dynamical system for an example. So this is the Selkov model for glycolysis, defined by these 2 equations here. And fixing the parameter value for A and varying the parameter value for B, can we see how the circular structure changes moving through? So we can see that as we increase this B parameter, we get this sort of stable feature that expands into a limit cycle where we're getting this very circular feature, and then it collapses back down. So can we use this method that works in a very nice synthetic example in the application, which might be a little messier? So to generate this data, we're going to fix a value of A at 0.1 and vary B in a range between 0.35 and 1. And then we're going to generate the time series corresponding to the x coordinates. While we may have the entire underlying model, in real life, that's not what you have. You typically only have one recording of some sort of observable, right? So we're just going to look at the x coordinates and look at their time series. We'll then use the delay embedding of the time series, where you choose a parameter, d the dimension, and the lag tau, and then you get these d tuples of points that are tau spaced apart on the time series. So here the red points correspond to the 2 dimensions. The first one gives you the x coordinate, and the second one gives you the y coordinate. And so you can see that this sort of noisy sine wave traces out this nice circle. Oops. So we have all of our collection of time series, and then we compute their delay embeddings, again, on the x coordinates. And we still see that there's this sort of circular feature that appears somewhere around 0.45 and persists through these middle parameter values and starts to collapse down between 0.75 or 0.8. So we're seeing that circular feature change as we're moving through the different time series here. So if we look at the example as a zigzag of the point clouds, we can see the colors here, each one represents a different one of the original point clouds, and we have the unions in between. And you can see that as we're changing this B parameter value, we're getting that circle expanding, where the red circle is now sort of encapsulating the green one, the purple one surrounds the red one. And as we move through, we can see that circle sort of expand and contract, and eventually getting down to a point where it starts filling in. One thing to note here is that because this behavior is so repetitive, what we're doing is actually taking the landmark complex, where we subsample from these original collections of points and take a smaller sample of them to improve computability, but it's still picking up the same patterns just on a smaller sample of points. And so then when we compute their Rips complex here, you can see, again, that same circular feature persisting through the middle point. And actually, because these points are sort of the same features expanding and contracting, we don't need to use a different radius. We can use one fixed radius value for each step in this Rips filtration, and it picks up the same circular feature as you move through. And so then when we actually look at the persistence diagram corresponding to it, we can see that the most prominent off-diagonal point here corresponds to a birth of 2, which corresponds to this point of 0.45, and it expands all the way down until 8.5, which corresponds to this point in between. So these again are the indices of which one of these points, or which one of these point clouds where it appears and disappears. So we're picking up exactly the range of values that we'd want to be seeing. And the nice thing is here that this is obviously one example of a dynamical system, but you can see this sort of behavior in various different settings and various applications. So all you sort of need to see here is that there's a circular feature that's expanding and contracting throughout. So,
oh, sorry, I'll
no, go ahead.
And there's a question from Woojin Kim. He asks, what was the method to choose the sample points one more time?
Oh yeah, so to choose the landmark points, we did sort of a max-min algorithm where you pick one point randomly and then pick the maximum one and continue picking the one that's furthest a point from all the selected points.
And the point is just that this dynamical system is so repetitive that you really just trace over the same points many times. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So these are so densely populated circles here that you don't really need all those points. It becomes repetitive. So by subsampling, you're still using this algorithm, you're still picking up the same structure, but just without all the repetition.
Thank you.
No problem. Oops. So yeah, so our method is really good at picking up this changing circular structure. In particular, it works on a nice simple circle example, but it also works on something like the Selkov model. And in the future, we want to apply it to experimental data where you don't necessarily know what this underlying equation is. You don't know what the underlying system is. You may only have a recording of a single time series and you want to pick up varying behavior, whether that be just one changing circle or many, or changing throughout the entire sequence. You may be picking up different behavior. And so this would allow you to pick up those changes in a way that's a little bit more compact than computing a persistence diagram for each step and then trying to analyze it from there. Also, hoping to improve the computation time in this using the landmark points definitely helps, but there can be some improvements to these algorithms as well. And so I thank you to my advisor, Dr. Munch, and our collaborators, and thanks to Michigan State, CMSE, and NSF. I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Let's briefly first unmute ourselves and applaud for Sarah for a very nice talk. So to start off with the first question, Elkanan Solomon, do you want to say it out loud, Elkanan?
Yeah, that sounds better. That sounds better. So just as a practical question, so I was wondering, what happens if you have a phenomenon where the point cloud is sort of slowly drifting, or there may be some small like instabilities in the location of the topology? Is there sometimes a need to mean center, or did they not?
Yeah, in this particular with the Selkov model, that didn't particularly come up because everything was so nicely aligned, but that's definitely something that's should be done if you do have that sort of drifting phenomena to ensure you're picking up the same cycle throughout.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a question chatted in by Ananthan Krishna Gopal. They say, this might be silly, however, there's no silly questions, but they ask, are some circles nicer than others?
Nicer than others. Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by nice. In our examples, we sort of want that bigger circular structure. And there are sometimes if you pick things wrong, or as was pointed out, if the circle's moving a little bit, your circles might not perfectly align, in which case you won't get the same homology class between two different things. So you might see that circle not quite merging with the same circle you want it to later on. So there definitely are nicer examples, like our nice expanding circles and so on, but hopefully using mean centering and stuff like that, there's ways around it. I don't know if there's if you had a different idea of nice in mind.
And another question that was chatted in, Vinoth Nandakumar writes, are there multi-parameter extensions of zigzag persistence?
Ooh, good question. I actually am not sure. That would be cool, but hard to imagine. Zigzag is already a bit computationally difficult, as is multi-dimensional persistence. That seems might be a challenge.
Computing it, yeah, would be a challenge, but it'd be nice to have it, right? You have
Oh yeah.
Zigzag, as you've described, but then you could vary the scale.
It would definitely be cool. If anyone wants to invent that, I'll be happy to use it.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yes. So thank you for this nice presentation. So I was wondering about your initial motivation. So you said when you have many persistence diagrams, you would have to compute them all. So I have two questions about this. So first of all, is it really cheaper to compute this one zigzag than computing all persistence diagrams? But then also, even if you had all these persistence diagrams, could you, I mean, if you had every persistence diagram for every B, I guess, would you be able to do the same thing? Or, I mean, you get something else, right? Because you have a different filtration.
Right, yeah. In terms of the computational complexity, that's something we're working on. I think it depends on how complex your point clouds are. Obviously, persistence depends on that as well, but the zigzag is also highly dependent on how complex the point clouds are. So I'm not quite sure which one's computationally better. It probably varies. But we're working on improving the computational complexity of this method. And then in terms of if you do compute each persistence diagram, you probably could get some similar results looking at something like maximum persistence or something like that, but it requires collection of a lot more data, right? You have to collect a persistence diagram for each one and sort of figure out the analysis from there. Whereas this, we're sort of hoping, is a nice one-step method where you can just hand it a collection of data and it'll spit out the result rather than trying to figure out the best way to extract those circular features from the collection of persistence diagrams.
Okay, thanks. A very quick follow-up. What method are you using for the zigzag?
To compute the zigzag persistence?
Yeah.
We're using the Dionysus code.
Okay, but because there is a newer algorithm by Udo and Maria, which claims to, I think it claims to be more efficient. I think it is implemented in Goody as far as I know.
In Goody? So, okay, I'll definitely have to look into that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Emily Purvine actually asked a similar question, which code, but something like Dionysus. Other questions?
Actually, I have one more quick question, if that's okay.
Oh, certainly.
So in the zigzag, you have this connecting piece be the unions with some Rips complex on the union. Is it possible to do something? I mean, it's such an open-ended question. Is it possible to do something else? But let's say you have like some good matching between the two shapes. In other words, is there something that's like computationally reasonable that could account for things like shifting or other geometric complexities that are somehow more intrinsic than just taking the union and then growing balls around it?
Definitely, yeah. Our assumptions here were sort of that you don't have any connections between the separate point clouds. But if you have a notion of, which point moves where along the sequence, then things definitely get better as the complexes get smaller to compute. And in the original Zigzag paper, there's the idea of the diamond complex, or the diamond principle, where you can look at the unions or the intersections and get complementary information. And obviously intersections are a lot smaller. So if we had some sort of data where you do have that identification as you go along, you could definitely make things better than taking this Rips complex in between. That's just sort of if worst case scenario, you know nothing about the relationship between them, then this is what you can do.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Sarah, I would like to ask a question if that's possible. If you could go back to the slide where you described the dynamical system that you're generating. And so I see. So B is the parameter that you're varying as you do the zigzag.
Yep.
Cool. I don't know much about dynamical systems. Do you know anything about the system, how they use it for glycolysis or what it?
I don't. I wish I did. I wish I knew how this actually impacted the real biological applications. It's probably something I should learn, but for now it's just sort of a nice template example to see how it worked. But the hope is that, yeah, maybe if you do have an application where this circular feature does signify something in your data, then someone who understands the data better than I do will be able to interpret it.
It's very nice. I like the rings of Saturn.
Yeah.
More questions.
Can I ask another one?
Of course. Keep them coming.
It's more
And then we'll go to Shmuel next. But go ahead, Michael.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No.
So what I was always wondering about zigzag persistence and how to use it. So in your case, you have a clear order of the diagrams because you have the speed parameter. But what if you don't have this? What if you just, you have you take random samples of a point cloud, 100 of them, but they have no natural order. And then the persistence of the bars depends a lot on how you order them, right? I mean, is there any theory for that?
Not that I'm aware of, unfortunately. Yeah, our method does depend on an ordering sort of being preset. So I'm not sure what would occur if you didn't have that. You'd probably have to do some searching to figure out what the best ordering is.
Right. At least some sort of heuristic that helps you to kind of get a meaningful diagram, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Shmuel, go ahead.
I might have misheard, or if I didn't, maybe there's something you can clarify, which was the idea of extending this to when you have one time series, and I didn't quite right? I mean, it was I could understand having, a sort of a dynamics that you were observing for a bunch of different things so that there was implicitly a parameter that was changing. But did you say that you wanted to apply this to a single time series or something? And I didn't quite understand what that would be.
Yeah, sorry, you broke up there for a second. But I think what you're asking is applying it to a collection of time series versus a single time series when I mentioned both. Okay, yeah, so applying it to a collection of time series, like you mentioned, you could vary something in your experiment that would allow you to see this change. Another idea we've considered is that if you have a longer time series, that maybe the behavior changes over time. Looking at the single persistence diagram, maybe you have a loop feature that appears in the middle, or a more periodic part in the middle of your time series, but at the end it sort of trails off. If you looked at the delay embedding of that, you might not see that circle forming because on either end you don't have the right behavior. So in this way, you could sort of split up your time series into chunks and see how the time series changes through time, or how that delay embedding changes through time.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Sorry, I did not explain that clearly.
No, now you did.
More questions? All right, well, if not, thank you again, Sarah, for a fantastic talk, and thanks to everybody for the lively discussion.
Yeah, thank you.